So let's take a look at the internet weather over the last week or so here, and I guess what I'm going to first start with is a little bit more than just the last week or so. I wanted to share with you the progression on reflection attack activity, that is specifically DDoS attacks using reflection attacks, and how that's been progressing over the last year, and then we're even going to take a look at the last 2 years here. So first of all, the last year of activity, and what this graph is basically showing us here, we're going to take a little closer look at this in a moment, is clearly near the end of last year, end of 2013, we saw this big growth in activity associated with network time protocol attack activity. We're also showing activity associated with DNS reflection, also associated with character generator reflection attack activity, and then just a little bit, you can see a little bit of activity associated with SNMP reflection attack activity. So some attempts to launch denial of service attacks using that mechanism as well. So these have continued to sort of evolve. Obviously, the NTP is overwhelmingly the most significant amount of activity that we're seeing continuing into 2014 here, although a good portion of the problem has been solved because organizations have been going through and disabling that monlist command, or getting that better under control. But there still are a lot of what I'll describe as rogue NTP servers out that sort of facilitate this attack activity. So this is the last year or so of activity. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to do two things on the next slide, is take a look at extending it out to 2 years of activity and also clipping off, that is controlling the scale on the Y scale here. So we've clipped it off at around 5 gigabits per second of activity aggregate on the network. And this is, I'm going to call this a Franken graph here. Basically, this green activity that's in 2014 is basically akin to the blue activity in 2013, and actually extends into about May or April of 2012. The significance here is this is both of these are associated with DNS activity. So looking way back in the 2012 May time period of 2012, you can see where DNS activity started from, and you can see this continuous sort of upward trend of activity going into 2013. And then the NTP activity sort of joins in the activity. We also see a significant growth near the end of, actually I'm going to take a little closer look here, in 2013, around the spring and May time period. Actually, it was a little bit of a surprise to me how much activity was associated with character generator. So character generator is something that we're going to need to take a little closer look at and try to get that activity curtailed along with the continuing NTP activity. And there seems to be sort of a less reflection activity associated with DNS lately, but it's still a problem that needs to be taken a closer look at as a community, as an internet community as a whole. And then once again, you can see this sort of little blurb of activity associated with SNMP reflection. You know, SNMP reflection has been considered one that has some potential threat associated with it, in that it can create a significant amount of amplification, but it turns out that there aren't that many devices that are exposed out there that seem to be responding to SNMP, certainly in comparison to character generator, which to me doesn't seem to serve any legitimate, meaningful or needed purpose.
I don't think there's that many character generator devices out there. Well, unless you start to go to other countries, which seem to have large pockets of them for some reason that I can't explain.
Right.
But in general, there's not a lot of character generator devices still out there.
Right.
Otherwise.
I think you sort of inadvertently pointed out a lot of this is with respect to a global internet, as opposed to perhaps most of the ISPs, I think, are relatively mature in the United States. There are certainly developing countries where the devices they're using aren't as modern, the tests that they're using aren't as well defined, their controls perhaps not as well managed, and so there are services being exposed that are perhaps shouldn't be.
Character generator traffic just stuns me that, in 2013, 2014, we're still seeing it. The 90s called and they want their DDoS attacks back. We've been talking for 15 or 20 years that you should be turning that off.
Well, and I guess another, we often sort of neglect this point. All of these attacks are facilitated through the ability to spoof source addresses onto the network. And so, best common practices are to provide ingress filtering mechanisms so that that is not possible. But so long as there's any one organization, one of the participants on the internet that allows spoof source addresses, it facilitates an opportunity to conduct attacks like this.
I think the real big surprise about NTP to a lot of us was that there's so many devices out there that were inadvertently running as NTP time servers, just because they turned on the NTP time sync protocol in general. But there's a lot of various devices out there that probably shouldn't have been running as an NTP time server themselves, yet they were.
Does it suggest that somebody whoever set these things up, turned on both the client and the server daemons at the same time and didn't know what they were doing?
No. I think it's a lack of turning them off.
Yeah, I think it's more. Yeah, I think it's more of like it was a default on kind of situation when you started the service. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what happens is, and this was actually, I think somebody had published an article that claimed 24 million DNS servers that are on the internet that don't need to be DNS servers, that they're inadvertently providing DNS. In fact, in many cases, they may be simply relaying to the actual DNS server that they're pointing toward. So a lot of the devices that are actually built from the MIPS processors, the ARM processors, they have development kits. The development kits come as basically a smorgasbord of tools. They develop the functionality around it, but perhaps neglect to turn off the other features that are a part of that kit, in effect, loaded on, and there you have services that don't belong there or perhaps aren't needed.
I see.
All right, so the next item here, let's look at some of the scanning activity we've seen on the network in the last week or so. And this is basically activity we're seeing over the last, extending just a little beyond a week here. Very regular automated scanning activity on port 53 TCP. This is also associated with DNS. We typically talk about UDP associated with DNS activity, but in this case they're scanning port 53 TCP, and 53 TCP tends to be associated with zone transfers. So this may be in fact looking around for DNS servers that are willing to allow a zone transfer, that is to see what domains are being served up by that server. The most aggressive scanning here is coming from a single address in China. As you can see, it's very regular in nature. It looks like on a daily basis going out and doing some aggressive scanning activity. And curiously, just looking at it from the perspective of how many connections they've been able to make, it looks like about 0.02% of the addresses that have been probed appear to be responding to this particular protocol. So I don't know if there's any fundamental significance to that, but it was merely an observation. Next item here is sources probing on port 443 TCP. This happens to be associated with the SSL, the protected web browsing HTTPS. In this particular case, what's significant is it's actually way back here on the April 7th that the Heartbleed vulnerability was identified. And we didn't see any significant number of sources probing. And this is, when we talk about probing, we're talking about sources that are trying to make lots of connections to lots of different addresses on the network. So there certainly was a lot of probing specific addresses to see if the Heartbleed vulnerability was present. And we saw, and we reported on that last week. But this is looking more at sort of a mass scanning activity. That is, do they have a botnet enabled to perform scanning activity to look for perhaps and this, we conjecture here that they're targeting or looking for vulnerable sites associated with the Heartbleed vulnerability. So we saw a little bit of a bump of activity. This is right around April 11th, a couple more bumps. But what we've seen more significantly is starting on, this was April 19th, a significant growth in the number of sources that are doing this probing activity, and it's gotten up around 5,000 sources and appears to be perhaps even growing still. So this clearly is suggestive of a botnet that's going around and doing more of a low and slow probing activity, but nevertheless doing that probing activity on a wide scale.
And I did take a quick look, not conclusive evidence, but at least some of these devices are home routers again.
Yes.
So there's some kind of Internet of Things possibly factoring into what this botnet is composed of that's engaged in this activity.
If I pointed out here, I neglected to mention that most of these sources appear to be in China, in Argentina. Yeah. That is, when I say most, I'm not saying it's the majority of the sources, but of the different places where we've seen them, more of them seem to be in Argentina. Now that suggests perhaps it's a little different demographic than we've seen in terms of the Internet of Things that we know of that have been compromised. So that's sort of an interesting observation. I also point out that the most aggressive sources of the actual probing activity are from China as opposed to the most sources in the case of Argentina. So having the most sources doesn't necessarily equate to the most aggressive probing activity. Okay, next item here is scam probes and sources on port 5666 TCP, and this port happens to be associated with the Nagios, which is basically I think it's an open source device management
platform.
Yeah,
like for monitoring if your systems are up and whatnot, yeah.
Right. So this is looking for health monitoring, and obviously there would be some motivation for attackers to go after this. What was kind of curious here, we've seen probing activity on this port in the past, presumably doing the same thing, but we've had a significant lull that is it's been very quiet for a large period of time up until just a few days ago here. And so what we've seen is most of the probes are from France and the United States, and most of the sources actually in the United States and Canada. So we're seeing both change in activity in terms of the number of probes as well as the number of sources doing those probes. It's not exactly clear what the motivation is, although I did find that around the middle of last year there was a vulnerability that was identified associated with Nagios. I think that may have been around the last time frame when we actually reported this sort of probing activity. Some exploit had been developed for it, and then there have been updates with that as late as January this year. So perhaps there are continuing updates that are taking place in the background, and they're looking around for targets. Somewhat conjecture there, but certainly a possibility for the motivation. Next item here, looking at the most probed ports. We're looking at the top 10 most probed ports. This is actually from April 22nd. At the top of the list, port 22 TCP. Next, port 23 TCP, and then that's followed by port 445. So 23 and 22, we've talked about this week in and week out, associated with these probes looking for password guessing attacks, predominantly against the Internet of Insecure Things devices that seem to be prevalently. Port 445 continues to be associated with the configure, latent infections associated with that. Next we see port 80, port 443 TCP. Many of those probes we talked about a little bit here, possibly associated with the looking for heartbeat vulnerabilities. Port 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, and then port 1433, Microsoft SQL database. Port 8080 TCP, basically alternate port for websites, and then last but not least here, port 53 UDP. Perhaps looking for DNS servers that could be used in reflection attack activity. Now in terms of the most sources probing, we see port 443 TCP at the top of the list. We already looked at the graph associated with that. Port 445, port 23 TCP, port 80 TCP, port 8080 TCP, and then we also see a couple of ports that are associated with the continuing to diminish zero access botnet.